Secretary Tom Ridge is with us, coming from Paris, and you're at this conference, and obviously the focus of this is the ongoing dialogue between the United States and world powers and Iran over their nuclear program. As we approach the deadline for some sort of deal, do you think that there will be anything significant, or will we see another extension of the deadline without much to show for it?
Well, I think the Ayatollahs have made it clear that they want things their way. Rouhani has said it. Khamenei has said it. You're going to limit inspections. It seems that we continue to make concession after concession, and the leadership in Iran gets a bigger and bigger smile on their face. So I sometimes think that the administration may be so desperate to sign anything because they've also voiced that notion it's either this deal or no deal, and obviously there are many of us assembled here in Paris that think there is an alternative to this deal, and that's simply a regime change. There's nothing that Iran has done since 1979 that would suggest that we could believe a single word that they've ever said. And if we remind ourselves, they are at the epicenter of terrorism in Yemen and the unsettled nature of what's going on in Syria. They've assassinated leaders in Lebanon. They support Hamas and Hezbollah. The list goes on, and yet somehow we think we can take their word. So hundreds of thousands of people here in Paris just don't agree with that point of view.
Should we be talking about new sanctions right now? If there's no firm agreement with Iran, should we be talking about increased sanctions?
Well, I think so. I think clearly we ought to continue to give sanctions and maybe squeeze them a little bit more. I mean, one of the interesting things about the proposed settlement, and this is something the president has talked about himself, which is very troubling. We've had a lot of assets that have been frozen. We're talking billions and billions of dollars, and they relieve sanctions. This is all around an agreement with an administration, with a country, with a leadership that is responsible for global terrorism, particularly everything that's gone wrong, all the chaos, the carnage in the Middle East. And so I think if they decide to postpone it again, and we don't get what we want, not what they want, then I think we ought to just not only sustain the sanctions, I think we ought to increase them.
Well, I want to switch topics a little bit because the TSA has been in the news a lot. Some pretty significant failures where more than 90% of testers were able to get through security checkpoints. There was some discussion about going back to privatized security at airports. How would you feel about a plan that focused on that?
Well, you know, the notion of privatizing airports and airport security has been around for a long time. I am of the notion and of the belief, I think, that some of them have been privatized, and initially that was an option in the legislation that created the TSA. Regardless of whether they're public or private, with this recent unfortunate set of circumstances revealed, is that the training is obviously not intense enough, the supervision isn't close enough, and like I say, in a lot of other organizations, the military trains over and over again, and so whether TSA is public or private, the training has to be continuous, it has to be sustained, because that's exactly what the threat is.
So you would suggest maybe a military-style training for TSA officers?
No, I don't think they need military training. I just alluded to the fact that the men and women in the military train over and over again. And the notion I was referring to is that you can't train the TSA periodically. You can't change them and then forget about them. I do think that training and practice is something that's critical to everybody. Police train regularly, fire departments train regularly, even when there's no crime and there's no fire. And I think this pointed out, among other things, the failure of consistent training and aggressive oversight. I regret that it happened because I think most people who work at TSA go to work and try to do a very good job every single day. Obviously, this suggested that they needed more training, and I hope they get it.
Yeah, across the board. And you look at, in a broader sense, the Department of Homeland Security today. Is it perhaps time to reassess what the entire organization is doing? Because not just within the TSA, but there has been problems elsewhere.
I think it had been the hope of the administration way back when. It's certainly been my aspiration for TSA that now that we're well into a decade in providing this fairly labor-intensive inspection, labor-intensive security, that we would start, as we've done with the pre-clear program, pre-clearing many, many more passengers. There's still the sight of youngsters and older individuals being subjected to secondary screening is troublesome. I don't blame the folks at TSA. Those are the regulations. Those are their instructions. So I think we need to move more aggressively to pre-screening, pre-clearing people. And I frankly think we're probably due for the next generation of technology that might assist the TSA a little bit more than the technology they have now. But I think at the end of the day, the ultimate answer is you pre-screen more people.
Now, a lot has changed since when you were Secretary of Homeland Security, but of course, the main goal is the same, keeping the homeland secure. What do you think, though, would be the biggest difference in the way you would approach the job today as opposed to, or the way you think it should be approached today as opposed to when you were running the show?
Think about that for a bit. I do think that people need to understand that Homeland Security is really a defensive operation. You like to think that your military, your intelligence, your allies, and law enforcement will get the potential perpetrators overseas. I think I would probably, a couple of things that come to mind, though, in response to your question. I think there has to be far, far more information sharing between the federal government and the state and locals. You cannot secure the country from inside the Beltway. And yet you have 600,000 or 700,000 men and women in uniform all over the country. And I frankly think the FBI ought to be a lot more willing to share timely and relevant information than they've been in the past. I think TSA can move to much more rigorous pre-screening. The airports are going to have to adjust their logistics so you can get more people on the planes quicker, simply because we've done the necessary and appropriate background checks. Other than that, I do think that the other thing I'd like to see one of these days is that there's a lot of technology out there, and getting it reviewed and approved one way or the other by the federal government writ large could be expedited. I know I've seen some technology that had applications in justice and perhaps in defense and in Homeland Security, and yet the men and women, the entrepreneurs, the businesses that have the technology, they would have to run through hoops and loops through all those departments. So I think one of the things that government could do generally is expedite the review of the technology. We don't need more people in TSA, but we certainly use a lot more and better technology. And I think it's a rather slow and cumbersome process to get technology reviewed and then applied.
Yeah, maybe some modernization could also get us through these checkpoints a little bit faster and safer at the same time. And I know you could be a very valuable voice out there on the campaign trail in 2016. Any early endorsements, Secretary Ridge, or you going to be out on any campaign stops in the near future?
Well, I start out being governor-centric. You know, once a gov, always a governor. I mean, I do think there's a lot to be said for men and women who had the responsibility and the accountability for making decisions, for driving an agenda through their legislatures, for making decisions that have significant effects, most of which can be seen in a relatively short period of time. So I start by being governor-centric, and my preference right now is the former governor of Florida. I think it's a pretty complex state. I think he did a lot in terms of keeping spending under control, reforming education. So as long as Jeb Bush will have me out there advocating for him, I'm a proud and strong supporter.
All right, thanks a lot, former Governor Ridge and former Secretary of Homeland Security Tom Ridge. Great to see you.
Great talking to you. Thanks for the interview.
My pleasure. Thank you.